So I'm sat with Oliver Double, who I'm not sure if he's quite aware how much influence he's had on this project already, because I was actually reading your book at the time when I came up for this with this idea for what we were going to do. But I wanted to just firstly talk to you a bit about kind of the history of stand-up comedy. In the book that I was reading, you kind of lay out almost a potted history of stand-up comedy from music hall to the modern day. So what is it about stand-up that makes it so unique?
I think it's a really interesting form, stand-up, because it's sort of easy to recognise, but it's actually quite difficult to pin down. So, you can see somebody like Bill Bailey, who's not a typical stand-up in his shows. He has music, he has bits of rock and roll staging, I mean, self-consciously so. It's like a sort of, almost like a kind of prog rock show at times with some aspects of the staging. And yet there's something at the core of it that makes it feel like stand-up. And I think it's to do with directness of communication. So it's to do with having somebody on the stage who's talking to you directly and with the intention of making you laugh. And so your reactions are really important. The show fails if you don't laugh. The show fails if you heckle and destroy the act. The show is less good if there's not fulsome applause at the end, and ideally, spontaneous applause punctuating the show. And it's that kind of live interaction, I think, that's at the core of it. I think the difficulty of saying that is you can also find other forms which sort of share that but aren't stand-up. So it's like if you listen to Johnny Cash's Prison albums, some elements of that are the same, right? So he does gags, they laugh, he talks directly to them. He's there in the moment. The audience's responses are vital.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm trying to say. It's very difficult to pin down. But I think if you're interested in sort of tracing it back, there are arguments for all kinds of things being early forms of stand-up. I mean, Shakespearean clowns or whatever it might be. For me, something like music hall is important because it started by the mid-19th century. And although primarily it's about singing, it is about singing straight out to the audience. And it's also about getting a laugh. I mean, not all the songs are funny, but comic songs predominate, especially by the 1890s. They're definitely the main thing. There are other things as well. I mean, songs where the main point is to get the audience joining in the chorus. You get sad songs too. But actually, comic songs are the main thing. And you might say, yes, but in music hall they performed in character and most stand-ups don't. And you kind of go, well, yeah, some of them do though. Al Murray, for example. And then the other thing is that it's true that most music hall singers performed in character, but actually with quite a lot of them there was a kind of core character underlying all of them. So take George Robey, for example. He has these kind of zany, big, drawn-on eyebrows like this. He has them whatever character he's playing. It's always George Robey. It doesn't matter whether he's playing a washerwoman or something, or his core character of the Prime Minister of Mirth. He kind of looks the same. Sort of same with Dan Leno, who's a small man, and he would play on his diminutive size in, doesn't matter what character he's playing, whether it's a shop walker or a beef eater or whatever. And somebody like Little Titch would be a really good example of this. So his real name was Harry Ralph. He came from Kent. He's where we get the word titch from. And he did all kinds of things. He did a comedy dance. That's the thing he's most famous for, with these big boots. He did a number of different comedy dances, but he also did, this kind of singing straight to the audience. And of course, the other thing that happens is that it stops being just singing. And then what happens is in the middle of the song, like the music drops away and they talk to the audience and there's spoken gags, that kind of thing. And I think, you can hear lots of different Little Titch pieces, but his voice pretty much always sounds exactly the same.
Yeah.
And the character is kind of the same. And in some bits, he just come on as Little Titch anyway.
Right.
As himself, as it were.
And you talked about kind of some comedians perform in character, but most people aren't really being a character as such. To what extent do you think it's important for stand-ups to reveal something about themselves?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that the birth of the modern stand-up style can be traced to the 1950s in the States. And I think the kind of slightly under-acknowledged hero is Mort Sahl. Sometimes people pronounce it Saul, but Mort-Saul, who started at the end of 1953. His first album was recorded without his knowledge, I should add. It was released 3 years later, but it was recorded in 55. So he's only been doing it just over a year at the time this is recorded. And if you listen to that, even though most of the references are obscure today, you kind of go, well, I don't know why that joke about particular kind of jazz is funny, right? But it is funny to that audience because you can hear the huge laughs.
Yeah.
But the point is, it's a guy coming on in casual clothes, talking like a human being to an audience about what the world looks like from his perspective. So he's talking about politics, he's talking about jazz, which was the youth culture of its time, he's talking about cars, culture, and there aren't any obvious kind of gags, but what there is that kind of live sharing of somebody's perspective, with an audience, and the audience are recognising the truth of what's being said in the form of their laughter.
So sort of the birth of observational.
Yeah, it's not just observation as well. It's satirical and I mean, he was called a sick comic because they would sort of, you could hear an influence from psychoanalysis and things like this as well. It's quite literate, funny comedy. It's not just a kind of, have you ever noticed how crap kettles are or something. There's a lot more to it than that. But yes, there is a big observational streak, and it's partly that knowing how to wield a reference. I forget who it is now, but there's a joke he does about East Coast jazz, and he goes, "It's any record without so and so on it." Right, and obviously that meant something if you were a jazz fan in 1955. It doesn't now, but that's not the point. The point is it was for that moment, right? And he does about. You can hear some pretty clunky edits on the album, but I mean he does about 50. I think he does over 50 minutes, and it's like you kind of most people would now. The received wisdom would be you start off, you do your open spots, you perhaps do that for 2 years, then you get to the point where you start to get paid halves, or perhaps if you're lucky you're paid 20, then you build to the point where you do your half hour, and then perhaps 6 or 7 years in you might do your first Edinburgh hour. This is a guy who practically reinvented the form from the ground up. And within less than 2 years, he's recorded doing over 50 minutes, getting like laugh, 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 laugh. Phenomenal.
Yeah, brilliant. And as kind of the art of comedy has shifted over time, or the movement has changed, who have been the real influential comedians, would you say? You obviously talked about Mort-Saul and the sick comedians. As it's continued to develop and change, who's been the influences?
Well, it depends on what side of the Atlantic you're talking about. But in the UK, two kind of important things that happened. First of all, when comedy started coming out of the folk clubs, so people like Billy Connolly, Jasper Carrott, Mike Harding, and others, because they were doing a more conversational style. They were also singing folk songs, bizarrely, but they were doing a more conversational style rooted in shared experience. So that was quite important, but it was also quite a small wave of comedian. It was really quite, the main thing in folk clubs was folk music, and there were just a few comedians who came up through it. The really big thing was in 1979 when the Comedy Store opened, very much building on the model of American comedy clubs. I mean, they even nicked the name of the LA Comedy Store. But what that did was it brought together people like Alexei Sayle, Tony Allen, French and Saunders, Rick Mayall, Keith Allen, Andy de la Tour, Jim Bartley, Pauline Melville. These people who had been interested in performing comedy, but perhaps they'd been involved in, some of them had been involved in sort of student comedy troupe, or some of them had been involved in alternative theatre, doing sort of political plays, that kind of thing. So somebody like Andy de la Tour had been part of various different political theatre groups like Belt and Braces and 784, and I think he'd started doing experiments with stand-up in 78, touring with Belt and Braces, some kind of road show that they were doing with bands and stuff. But the point is that the Comedy Store sort of brought those people together, and then they formed a thing called Alternative Cabaret, which in a way, by doing gigs in student unions and pubs and old cinemas and things like that, sort of laid the ground for the current comedy circuit. And then the group that became the comic strip sort of broke out of that scene, and they started a venue called the Comic Strip, and then they had a TV series and things. So I mean, those early people, they might not necessarily be remembered, but indirectly, somebody like Tony Allen is a really important influence because he was a huge figure in the early scene. Never kind of broke big on telly, but you listen to the recordings of performances that he did at that time now, and it's really interesting because there's a lot of improv going on. There's a lot of that same sort of thing that Mort Sahl was doing in the 50s, the kind of just talking about kind of culture. And I know Lenny Bruce was a big influence on Tony as well. And then there are observational bits, there are bits, silly jokes, there's all kinds of things, but a lot of it we'd recognise. Same with Andy de la Tour, there's bits where he's just talking about things from his childhood where you kind of go in it in a slightly different way. Something like McIntyre would be doing that, but then suddenly he's talking about Northern Ireland, you go, okay, that's what McIntyre wouldn't do, because he wouldn't want to kind of get into something so controversial.
Do you think because you're seeing comedians kind of now who are selling out arenas, for example, and having big crowds, do you think that that's brought a shift in material then? So someone like Michael McIntyre, who would play to a big audience, wouldn't want to be political in that way or cut off an audience in any way?
I think what's happened to comedy is that it's got a bit more like, let's say, book publishing, where at the bottom end you have somebody who's getting an advance of a couple of £100 and selling a few hundred copies at best. And at the top end you've got J.K. Rowling, right? So it's a bit like that in comedy. So at the bottom end you've got people who are... I mean, I was talking to a guy I used to know on the circuit a few months ago, and we were talking about, I mean, I haven't played the circuit regularly since the late 90s. We were talking about how much you get paid now, and actually it's sort of the same, right? But it's nearly 20 years ago, right, that I was doing it. So, and in some cases they're paying less. And then, of course, at the bottom, even below that, you've got the open mic circuit with people who perhaps do that for 3 or 4 years before they get paid for anything. And then at the other end, you've got people who can clear... I mean, the biggest stars in comedy are literally earning tens of millions a year. And what that does is it creates a really, really bizarre ecosystem where it's hard to see it being a straightforward meritocracy because, just to a certain extent, I mean, it is talent that gets people to the stadiums, but then there are people who are equally, if not more talented, who haven't got to stadiums, right? But I think, of course, the people who are likely to get on, and you get to a stadium, broadly speaking, through TV exposure, and it's not true to say that TV just wants bland, because I mean Frankie Boyle is a very successful comic who, is not certainly couldn't be accused of being bland, but I think possibly there are comedians who are a bit more niche. Like Stuart Lee. I mean, to me, Stuart Lee is one of the all-time greats. Absolutely. People go on about Bill Hicks and people like that, and they were great, or Lenny Bruce. But I think we've got one of them now, and I think British people have a terrible inferiority complex culturally. There's always a thing of America's ahead of us, and something like Louis C.K. is undoubtedly an amazing comic. I mean, phenomenal. There are other great American comics around at the moment as well. Margaret Cho's great. Patton Oswalt's great. There are various ones around, Maria Bamford, but just because they're great, in some ways I think the best British comics are better because I think there's a much firmer tradition of kind of long conceptual shows in the UK through the Edinburgh Fringe. So somebody like Josie Long is a phenomenal comedian, but I mean somebody like Stuart Lee is, I mean he plays big theatres now. Don't make no mistake about it, and he's had good TV exposure as well, but it tends to be sort of minority channel. It tends to be alternative taste as opposed to mainstream taste. But what he's doing with the form is extraordinary. I mean, I saw him do a show last year, which was a warm-up to his last series of Comedy Vehicle. And he did a bit where he sort of pretended that he could see the ghosts of dead comedians who'd been worn down by the cruelty of audiences to the point where they committed suicide or whatever. Yeah. And of course it's hilarious because that he isn't really haunted, or, even in his mind, by these people. But that bit was convincing enough as a kind of simulated nervous breakdown that apparently a journalist tweeted, "Just seen Stuart Lee have a nervous breakdown." I think if you can do that, if you can fool a journalist into thinking they've seen something that they just haven't, then you are doing something very interesting with the form.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a big fan of Stuart Lee as well, but I would argue that he wouldn't want to be part of the mainstream at all. It suits him very much to take his position where he is outside of that.
One of the things that he does that's very clever is manufacture more disdain for his work than actually exists. So he could be playing a gig at, let's say, the Marlow Theatre in Canterbury, and he'll pretend that everybody on the balcony has only come because they've been brought by their friends, because it's part of the kind of shtick, really, that he's bitter and not. He has to feel like he's underappreciated. And so he increasingly has to manufacture that, and it's increasingly implausible because, everybody knows all the critics love him, right? And oh yeah, I know there are people who criticise him, but and also that he's had 4 series of comedy. That's really unusual in this day and age for somebody to have solo series, that number of them, and that much artistic control. He's playing a big theatre and everything like that, and yet he's still skilled enough to make it seem like he's failing, because that's part of what he does. He has to pretend to fail.
And it's also unusual to see stand-up. I mean, I know you have Live at the Apollo, which has kind of come back round, but to see a stand-up show, which for half, I know, and also he intercuts it, doesn't he, with those sections that he does with Chris Morris, but just to have stand-up on TV, you don't get that so much anymore, would you say? Or
it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think it's interesting because when I did the first edition of my book, Getting the Joke, I was working on that in like 2003-4 into 2005, and I remember people still at that point were saying, well, stand-up doesn't work on TV. And I interviewed Ross Noble, who I used to know on the circuit, and he said he was just building, I think maybe he just recorded it, or he was just building up to doing it, and he said, there's this thing, it's called Jack D Live at the Apollo, which was the original title. Jack D presenting comedians, you get a lot longer, it's set up properly for comedy, and it's going to look great, and it's going to change things. And he was completely right. It started a kind of explosion in British stand-up that nobody had really foreseen, I think. And then part of, so I think things like Live at the Apollo were real game changers in making stand-up a big mainstream success on TV. But that format of having an individual comic being the centre of a predominantly stand-up show, that's something that's quite rare. You used to get it with people like Dave Allen, did some great series like late 80s, early 90s that worked with that format. Jack D did a couple of great series of that in the early 90s. But yes, that is quite unusual now, I think, to go, right, there's your vehicle,
Yeah, as it is, yeah. Tell us a little bit about your own kind of journey into stand-up comedy. But what first made you want to be a stand-up?
Well, when I was growing up, I was really into comedy. I got into the theatre through school. I was really into music. I was really into punk, and I probably wanted to perform in any of those things. But when I was studying drama at university, 2 things happened. One was that Saturday Live started, and I'd been into the young ones, but I'd perhaps not seen that style of comedy done in the stand-up format. And although the stand-up spots were the minority of things that were happening on that show, they were the bits that caught my attention. So that was happening, and at the same time, or around the same time, I saw a thing called Chaotic Cabaret, which was something that was put on. It wasn't even called the Guild of Students. It was so up itself, the Exeter University at the time, they called it the Guild of Students, right? But the Guild of Students used to put on, they used to have an arts committee, which I was involved with, and they used to put on a thing called Chaotic Cabaret once a term. The idea was anybody could get up and perform, do anything they wanted to, and you got a can of beer if you did it. So the first one I saw, it was just like it's really hard to explain why, but it was like a light bulb went on in my head. I just went, this is amazing, I want to do it. I don't have anything to do tonight, but I really want to be on that stage. And I tell you who was on that night. John O'Farrell, the comedy writer, was doing a kind of stand-up character. He was doing a skinhead character. And various other people were doing, it wasn't all stand-up, but people were doing stand-up acts. And I just went, that is brilliant, I want to do that. That is what I want to do. And so the next time I did one, I prepared something alone. I did a two-hander with a friend, and then I improv'd a whole other thing as well. So I got 3 cans of beer, right? and I think that was the start of it really. And then I started kind of doing sort of bits of stand-up through the rest of my degree, and then went off to do a PhD about stand-up, and that's when I started sort of trying to, find other people who are interested, because you can't really start a scene just by yourself. And we just started doing student gigs. Eventually ended up taking a show to the Fringe in '89, and started to sort of get gigs either as a package of acts or just individually. That's really how I got into it.
And when you were kind of that end of the 80s, early 90s, kind of touring as a comedian, what were the highs, what were the lows of that?
Well, the highs are every time it works. It's particularly when it first happens. I mean, I had a gig at Exeter Arts Centre. It would have been about 85, I think. It could have been 86. It just opened. I think it was like the first week it had opened. They were doing a cabaret, and it was still called cabaret in those days. And I saw the other acts, and with the arrogance of youth, I was like, oh, these guys aren't very good. And actually, some of them were good, but I decided that I was going to go out and do a rap and a song on a mandolin, and I was going to that mandolin down there, in fact, and then what? But then I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll put something stupid on. I'll wear something stupid. So I got these boxer shorts that. There was a long story behind them, but they were homemade boxer shorts that went down to about here. It was when boxer shorts first became like big, and these were enormous, right? I put them on, and then I think I had army boots on, and then I had like a Cub Scout scarf around my neck, and then just before I went on, I borrowed some Ray-Ban sunglasses. I just went on like that, and I went on to the biggest laugh, like enormous laugh, because I looked ridiculous, right? And I thought, okay, this is nice, right? And I improv'd a whole 10-minute routine based on the private jokes I'd had with friends. And I did the other bits that I planned to do as well, but I just came off like, okay, that's amazing. That's what I want to do for the rest of my life. And then of course it's really hard to then get back to that same level. So I think learning how to do comedy isn't a smooth curve like that. It's like a kind of jagged thing with highs and massive lows, and actually what you want is for that zigzaggy line to kind of go up gradually like that, and then probably smooth out, so it's a bit more predictable kind of thing for you, not necessarily for the audience, but you get better at it. It's about learning how not to fail as much as learning how to do it. And I think it means learning a lot about yourself. I mean, the failures, I could say so many. One of the things when we used to tour as this little group of comics was that you'd turn up at a venue and they'd have not a clue how to set a gig up. So you'd be put on an indie disco, right? It was a 90s thing, You'd be put on a student indie disco, and they just get to the point where people were starting to dance and the ice was breaking. They go, "We've got some comedians on for you," and of course everybody goes, "Oh, fuck off," and so you go on to just total antipathy, and then you completely live down to that, and then you kind of walk off feeling like you've wasted an evening and half of your ego's gone. But then I think the biggest highs are where you go on to that situation and somehow triumph anyway, and that can happen. I remember doing a gig, it would have been, I can't remember where it was now, but it was some desperate student gig. Might be Neen College, Northampton, right? And it was just, there was a beer promotion with students, and it sold out within half an hour, and everybody just had tables full of alcohol, and I think it was that one where I just came, and the PA was dreadful, like feeding back, you couldn't be heard. And I think I'm probably mixing a few different gigs together anyway. But I came on. The first thing that happens is the microphone falls apart, and there's a huge laugh at my expense, of course. But I just kind of accepted the laugh, and then just because I got that, and because I didn't care as well, because I'd seen a number of other people being badly treated by the audience, I sort of didn't care. So I kind of did the whole thing with a kind of studied disdain, and of course then it's like it's like a dog knowing you're not afraid of it. It's just then it wants to be your friend kind of thing. It was like that, and then you come off and you feel like a god. But so part of it is just being in the right moment. You just so happened you won them over, and then part of it is, I suppose, that you had some experience that allowed you to kind of connect with that difficult situation. But
okay, and then you had a big gap, and we'll talk about that in a moment, of the other things you were doing. But last year you came back to stand-up comedy. You did a show. What was it made you want to revisit and come back to being on stage?
So, I've never really managed to give it up. So I stopped doing regular circuit gigs in 1999. But since I've been working here at the university, I've been teaching things to do with stand-up through most of the intervening time. And when I'm doing gigs with my students, you know, I always compare them. And comparing is stand-up. I mean, it's, you know, you have a job to do, and it's to do with getting the audience in that place they need to be. And part of that means you have to get them laughing before you put the first poor sap on who's got to kind of go out and face them. And you know, so if we've got the MA up and running, you know, I will do 11 of those in 11 weeks for between sort of October and Christmas. And then I've done the occasional other thing as well. So like, I mean, I had some friends who ran a comedy night in Whitstable where I live, and I compared that for a year, you know, not too long ago. And like 10 years ago, I did a show about my kids having type 1 diabetes. And on the back of that, I did a load of gigs for diabetes organisations in the UK and in the States as well, a couple of gigs. So it's not like I came back not having done it. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like I've never not done it, sort of thing. And what maybe go back to what made me want to do another kind of big solo show though was that basically I was coming up to my 50th birthday and I fell over and broke my hip. And the top tip, don't break your hip, it's really sore. I was running, which is supposed to be healthy, but it's not if you break your hip, right? And it was, I mean, it's very, I mean, I've got a bit of metal in my leg, which will always be with me. And, you know, I had to learn to walk again. I was housebound for a month. I was in a geriatric ward for over a week, you know. So that forces you to think about your life. And I, as a way of sort of processing the experience, I started writing in a notebook, this notebook in fact. And I just started writing things, you know, about what had been happening to me. When I got out of hospital, I kind of, you know, I was writing notes about what had happened here. And I was telling people about it. I was telling people about things that had happened to me, and they were laughing. And I was thinking, okay, that's interesting. And particularly, I had a phone conversation with my auntie, who's, I don't know how old she is. I mean, you know, at least in her 70s, and she was very nice. But I was talking to her about these painful, depressing things that had happened to me, and she kept saying, "Oh dear," right? And she wasn't being mean. It wasn't sinister. It was just sort of going, yeah, okay, well, I've had some of this because I'm of the age where I'm going to have had some of this, and I know what you go through, and it's all right, right? And it was very kind of liberating. So I thought, well, okay, well, maybe what I should do is do a stand-up show about it. So I thought, well, I talked to the people who run the theatre on campus, the Gulbenkian Theatre. It's a sort of 350-seater, and I said, look, you know, could I do something here? And they just sort of went, yeah, that sounds interesting. So that's what I did. And what I did was I was quite interested in documenting how I went about making that, so that I'm writing a couple of journal articles about it at the moment, because you know, until quite recently there wasn't a huge amount that you can find out about how comedians actually work. There is now through people like Stuart Goldsmith and Richard Herring doing really interesting podcasts where they interview comedians and talk about how they work. And things like Stuart Lee as well, writing about his own work, you know, sort of laying his method bare, if you like. Steve Martin also wrote a very good book where he talks about how the thinking behind his stand-up and how he created different effects and things. But you know, that's quite recent, and I thought that actually it would be interesting to sort of not hold myself up as an exemplar, but just because I thought people might be quite interested in what I was doing. So I started recording a podcast, which I put out. It's very easy to put a podcast out on iTunes now. So I in the period leading up to the gig and then directly after it, and even during the gig, I recorded part of an episode, right? And I thought that, you know, it was an incredibly niche thing, because I mean, nobody's really heard of me as a comedian, and, you know, like, so what, I did a show in a theatre in Canterbury. But actually, we've had sort of, I don't know, 1,700 downloads or something. So, and some people came to see the show because they'd heard the podcast as well. That's the other thing that's worth mentioning. And and it was important for me to do that while I was doing it, because the difference between that, I think, and something like Stuart Goldsmith's Comedian's Comedian is, well, which I'm not doing that down at all, it's brilliant, but is that generally that he's asking people to reflect back on what they've already done, whereas I was looking forward to something I was actually in the active process of making. And I think most comedians don't rehearse as such. They rehearse in public through warm-up gigs and things and work in progress gigs. But I've always been somebody who sort of rehearsed. And I know there is a minority of comedians who rehearse, and that's something that's been not talked about a lot. And I was quite interested in talking about that, because it's horrible. It's the worst thing in the world to rehearse. It's vile. I really understand why most people don't do it, because the point is, I didn't have a big enough following to be able to do warm-up gigs. There's no way that anybody would want to see that show twice, right? So, let alone 3 or 4 times, right? So, I basically had probably everybody in the world who would have liked to have seen the show was there in the theatre that night. So I had to rehearse, and it was horrible rehearsing. It was absolutely vile, but I definitely think it paid off, because it meant that I could internalise like an hour and a half show, and I wouldn't have been able to do that without rehearsing. And also, it meant that I could actually, paradoxically, it gave me the freedom to address things that were happening on the night, in the moment, because the show was so internalised. It meant I didn't have to worry about commenting on something, because I knew where I was going back to. It was easy to step in and out of the material. It's really important that you have to be able to do that.
And be in the moment and react to what's going on in the room around you. The other thing that you just reminded me of that you touch upon in the book a little bit, and also was clear from the show, from looking it up and seeing bits on YouTube and things like that, is the influence, or I imagine that you're fairly heavily influenced by Brecht.
Yeah.
And had, it was quite episodic, and you had the placards almost, although they were projected.
Well, I think I used the slogan, "It's Brechtian, motherfucker."
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, so how much do you see this kind of parallel between theatre and stand-up, or one drawing from the other?
Right. Okay. So there is a massive cultural divide, particularly in the UK, I think, but I think in other countries as well, between popular theatre, or forms that are so popular they wouldn't even be considered to be theatre, and legitimate theatre, conventional narrative theatre where the play has been published, it's actors, it has all their credits in the programme saying what they've been on the bill normally, or Casualty, that's another good one. That's probably a bit more at stake because it hasn't been on for a few years, but you know what I mean. That's theatre. McIntyre at the O2, that's not. The Arts Council won't even fund it. It's not even art, right? But if you read a book like Peter Brook's The Empty Space, the first thing he says is, to paraphrase, a man walks across an empty space while somebody else is watching, and this is all that needs to happen for an act of theatre to have occurred. Somebody's watching somebody else do something. And I think that's a really revolutionary thought, because it means that then you start to see pop music as theatre, you start to see stage magic as theatre, you see music hall as theatre, you see stand-up comedy as theatre, cabaret as theatre. Right. And that's really important. But there is a divide, and there was a divide 100 years ago. There was a court case in the early 20th century where a theatre manager tried to take the manager of a music hall to court for presenting unlicensed plays, and he argued that Little Titcher's act and the act of an American ventriloquist were plays, and he lost. Right? He lost the case. They're not plays. Because they're not plays, the solo act was not subject to theatre censorship. It wasn't subject to the Lord Chamberlain's rules. So Max Miller, in theory, could say anything he wanted on stage. In practice, there were sort of complicated forms of censorship. But the point is that the gap, because there's been this historic gap between stand-up and theatre, people see them as occupying different universes. But in any sane definition of theatre, stand-up comedy is theatre. So back in 1999, I did a conference in Wolverhampton about popular theatre, and we were part of the first panel, and it was me, a guy called Chris Ritchie, who started the comedy degree at Southampton Solent, which is now defunct sadly, and Tony Allen, early alternative comedy guy, alternative comedian, one of the first, very seminal figure. And we were talking about stand-up, and in the audience was Dario Fo, right? The legendary Italian theatre maker who's just died. And so the time comes for questions, and Fo stands up and in Italian, through a translator, he starts saying, "This is a false debate. There is no divide." And he starts talking about, medieval jesters and all this kind of thing, and saying that. But the thing is, if you watch Fo's solo shows like Mr. Buffo, it's just like a bit of stand-up. In fact, there are bits of it that are like specific bits of stand-up. So there's a bit where he talks about this corrupt pope, and it's very like Lenny Bruce's God and Moses routine, right? So the point is, there are strong connections. So somebody like Mark Thomas, a hugely underrated comic in my view, is an amazing comic, not just for his politics, but also because of what he does with the form of stand-up, like expanding form. Anyway, he says that Brecht was one of his main influences. He talks about being taken as a kid to see Caucasian Chalk Circle, and how that really gave him the idea that you could go into a theatre thinking one thing and come out thinking something quite different. And Brecht performed in cabaret, right? And in cabaret it was much the same audience performer dynamic as in stand-up. People performed straight out to the audience. The audience could heckle, the audience were drinking, they were sat around tables. Very light stand-up. And the conferencier, the MC, would talk about topical things, would perform as him or herself. It's very like that. And Brecht was really influenced by that. He had a very good friend, Carl Valentin, who was a performer who worked in cabaret and less high class venues as well. And Brecht went on record as saying that some of his ideas came from working with Valentin. Some of the key moments of epic theatre kind of came to him from working with this guy. Brecht put on a cabaret. I mean, he had one professional appearance in cabaret, and he nearly caused a riot, right? So, and apparently, when the proprietor of the cabaret came to talk to him afterwards, she said, she came to say, well, you're right, and he said, yeah, why wouldn't I be? And she went, well, because did you not hear how they reacted? He went, so what? I think a lot of the ideas that he writes about in terms of acting, you could apply to the craft of stand-up. So he talks about when Charles Laughton played Galileo, famously, and he talks about how you could see the character of Galileo and the actor Laughton at the same time. Now, if you think about watching Richard Pryor playing a deer in the forest in his stand-up routine, he still does an imitation of a deer drinking in the forest. It's not Stanislavski in immersive acting. You don't go, wow, that was a deer. You go, there's a deer and Richard Pryor at the same time. It's the same kind of dynamic. And a lot of the ideas of the alienation effect as well, you can apply to joking as well. That's another thing.
Brilliant. And so here at the University of Kent then, you teach stand-up comedy to, is it undergraduates or all MA students? Or
Both. So I teach an MA in stand-up comedy, and also I teach a third year module as part of the drama degree to undergraduates on stand-up comedy. So that it starts off with a kind of historical theoretical introduction to stand-up, and then it moves into a practical phase where they work towards performing their own 5-minute stand-up routines. And
when the students turn up kind of presumably inexperienced, what are they looking for from your course?
I don't know. I mean, you'd have to ask them, but I mean, I think some of them just kind of go, this is intriguing. Some of them go, well, maybe this is something that I want to do. And some of them go, this is what I want to do. This is a first step. And I'd say they're probably quite a small minority. Because actually, I think doing stand-up, this is going to be a slightly controversial statement, but I've read about people kicking heroin, right? And they want already addiction, and they go, the thing is, you have to want it. You have to truly have made the decision. And I think it's a bit like that starting stand-up, because it's so difficult to start. It's not. I don't think it's quite as difficult as a kind of performance mode as people say it is, or it's popularly believed to be. But I think what is difficult is because there's so much competition out there, to actually get your foot on the bottom rung of the ladder is intensely difficult. So, every year, I get, the vast majority of my students could do a convincing 5 minutes, admittedly to a home crowd. It's not that, it's getting from that to the point where somebody's going to pay you money to do it. That's the difficult bit. And I think it's only a small minority of students who have that drive,
So what's your kind of, obviously it's a whole, you can't explain in 2 minutes, but kind of what's the fundamental of what you're trying to get across to those students?
Well, the fundamental thing about stand-up is it starts with the individual student. It has to, because that is what stand-up's about. It has to start with something within you. So basically what I have is a series of things that I do with them that give them the opportunity to explore aspects of themselves, which then I can pick up on and encourage them, where they're doing something interesting, encourage them to do that. In addition to that, so for example, one of the things that I sort of invented about, 16 years ago, it's such a simple exercise. You just get people up one by one and get them to have a conversation with the rest of the group who form an audience. And there's nothing more to it than that. You don't say you have to get a laugh. You don't have to talk about any particular thing. We talk a little bit about what a conversation is, the fact it's two-way, and how you can keep a conversation going. But it's amazing how you get somebody up speaking for 2 to 5 minutes and you see all kinds of things that you didn't see before. You see unusual ways of standing, things, what they do with their face, their voice. A lot comes out with the voice. The kind of attitude that they take towards other people. All of that stuff can become part of the act. The other aspect that you have to work on is joke structure. That's a lot harder to do because you don't want to teach them a reductive formula, I think. I think actually teaching a reductive formula can be very effective, but it's not what I'm interested in doing. Because I think if you teach a reductive formula well, if you follow it well and do it properly, it can work. But is that going to make the most interesting comedy? Possibly not. But you need to sort of. I think that there's a mistake that people make. It's like with Mort. Go back to Mort Sahl. People go, "Oh, he didn't tell any jokes," and you kind of go, "Well, that's kind of true, but it's also not." So there's a great bit on his album At the Hungry Eye, which I think was about 61, right? It's recorded live at this legendary San Francisco venue, the Hungry Eye, which wasn't just a comedy venue. It also had, folk singers and jazz bands and things, poets, But that's where he started out. And it's, if you've ever seen the movie Big Eyes, there's a scene set in there in that film. But anyway, it's recorded in the Hungry Eye, and there's bits in it which don't make sense now, but there's bits in it which totally do. So there's a bit where he talks about he's walking through Central Park and he sees a gang of young ne'er-do-wells, and he goes up to them and he says, "I told them I admired their vagabond existence and I wanted to join them." He said they couldn't handle the pressure, so they ran away. "Come back, you forgot your knife," right? And that works. That's a joke. It's an idea.
Yeah.
And it comes out conversationally, but that's actually a joke because it's about sort of taking a kind of incongruously intellectual liberal approach to a kind of gang situation, right? And then they run away. And of course that's funny in its own right. That's a joke. It's still a joke. It's just disguised as conversation. And I think when you hear, the most sort of conversational, naturalistic, as it were, stand-up comic, there's still structures underlying it. So I think the mistake that a lot of people make is that I can just get up and talk about what I think of the world, and that's as simple as that. There are always jokes in there. It's just that they're not necessarily Jimmy Carr's Tim Vine style jokes where they're beautifully crafted and there's no fat on them whatsoever. It's just like every syllable, that's a thing in its own right. It's a very demanding style of writing. Milton Jones is an amazing comic at that. But the fact is that it's only a minority of comics who work in that style because it's so difficult to do. Most people work in a more conversational style, and so people kind of go away thinking, well, it's just talking to an audience. It isn't. There's something else going on. So that's quite hard to teach.
And because you have your students in the third year, presumably, for a year, MA students maybe a year or two, maybe?
Yeah, the third year students, it's a term, so it's 12 weeks. Right. The MA students, it's a year.
So what are the big challenges that they face in that time, often?
Well, with the third year students, it's just the fear. It's the fear. It's like I play with that a bit to sort of get used to the idea that they are going on, this is going to happen and it's all going to be fine. From the very beginning, when they don't even do practical workshops. The practical workshops start like week 6, so it's just before halfway through the term. And what you try to do is just get them to the point where it just feels like it's fun. It feels like it's messing about. The ideal atmosphere is it feels like it's just messing about in the room. For me, that's how I teach. But they will stress, undoubtedly, and all of them will, even the ones who pretend they're totally confident. They're all stressed about it. And then what you do is, I mean, one of the reasons I compare the gigs is to try and use all my skills to make it as good a possible gig as possible before the first one goes on. And then when they've heard the first one getting laughs, they ease up a bit, I think. It's still scary for them, but it's a lot more doable for them. And then it's a bit of a demanding gig, that, because it's a bit like a game of keepy uppy, because there's the ones who are a little bit more tentative. If they have a thing where it's not quite hitting, you've got to get the audience back up before the next one comes on. But then again, you've only got a certain amount of time to do that, so it's quite difficult. With the year-long thing, the difficult thing is, the real hump actually is week 2. So they all go on week 1. Some of them go on week 2 as well. And if they don't go on week 2, they go on week 3. So week 2 or 3 is the hard thing, because the first thing happens in a blur of adrenaline, right? They're high, really scared, they're terrified. Perhaps they get a bit drunk beforehand. They go on, most of them smash it. They come off, great. And then it's like, okay, well, you've got to do it again, but with new material, right? So that's the hard thing. It's not the first one. It's beginner's luck, really. Go on, you have a good time. Not everybody has a good time. Actually, some people build to it, and they only really hit their stride a bit later on. So that's difficult. And then the other thing that's difficult is they have to go out and do gigs in the real world. They have to go out and do open mics, and that's really stressy for them, because so many open mic gigs are playing to a small audience, mainly made up of friends of the other acts. You have to go out and leaflet for an hour beforehand, and it's just horrible. It's just a sort of fairly unplayable gig. Well, not unplayable, but it's just an unrewarding gig. And that's hard for them. Some of them find that, because especially if they've travelled to London for the privilege of that kind of ego loss, that's hard for them.
Okay, so the whole idea behind this documentary is that I'm going to put myself in a position where I'm learning this whole process that we've been talking about, and go and be a stand-up. So I've got 1 year to start from no experience whatsoever to doing a show at Edinburgh next year.
An hour show?
No, probably not. Ben, my colleague here, is a promoter in Milton Keynes. So what we'll probably look to do is for him to take a show that I will be part of.
Oh, that's
good. So maybe 20 minutes, half an hour.
Yeah, that's good.
Of that hour. And I'm at that stage that you were just describing. So I've done 2 gigs now. Yeah. Gig number 1 was a showcase where it was friends and family of the people at the comedy school. We're all doing our very first gig. There's 100 people in the audience. We all went out and had a great time. And then I did the same 5 minutes 4 days later to an audience of 6 in a backwater pub, and had a very, very different experience. What can you tell me about the next year that you think will be important for me to go out and learn and experience in the build-up to Edinburgh?
3 things that you need to make it as a comic. Talent, luck, persistence, of which persistence is the big one. Talent, you can do something about. I mean, you can't do anything about native talent, but most people have a certain amount of native talent in making people laugh. We all make people laugh in everyday life, so if you can somehow make the leap of doing that onto the stage, you can get there, and you could work on your talent anyway by constantly writing and constantly challenging yourself to do better. Record yourself, always listen back, always try and learn from it. If you've had a horrible gig, it's hateful, but actually it's quite cleansing to listen to it, because then you can put it behind you. So you can do something about that. Luck, nothing you can do about that. Some people are just very lucky. I know of people who got their first paid gig because they did a stand-up workshop, and somebody was short of a comedian, at short notice, and they'd seen them and thought they were quite interesting and sort of come and do this gig, So that can happen, but for most people it doesn't. And then persistence, because it's so lousy, you have to just keep going, and not just keep going, but you have to keep working at the talent bit as well, however depressing it is. If you can get to the point where you can play those horrible 6 people gigs, 6 people is probably harder than playing the O2 Arena. Because at the O2 Arena, at least there's a chance of sort of, I don't know, I've never played at a stadium, I don't know, the biggest audience I've played to is probably 2,000 or something, and that was an outlier for me. Perhaps I'll tell you about that in a minute. But I've never played to 12,000 people in an arena, and probably, it's very, very difficult, I don't know. But the point is, the laughter is infectious, and if you've gone to an evening where you're one of 6 people, the first thing you think is, oh, this is going to be a bit sad, right? Because you're surrounded, and also, that social thing of laughter spreading is much more likely once you've got 30 people or 100, much more likely again if you've got 100, if you've got 300. Let's say you've only got 1 in 3 people laughing, you've still got 100 people laughing, right? So you play to 1,000, 1 in 10 you've still got 100 people laughing. It's a decent laugh. If you can get 800 laughing, and then of course there's a thing where laughter becomes a rhythm, and the audience get into the thing where they don't even know why they're laughing, after a while. So, I think that being able to play to 6 people is a tough gig. So if you can get to the point where you can find a way of making that crap situation fun for that audience, if you can kind of go, look, I know, but let's just agree this is going to be fun. If you can find a way of doing that, you can get there. I think the other thing, very important, networking. Every time you play with somebody you like, ask how they got, who's a bit further on than you, ask how they did it. Every time somebody says something nice about you, say, okay, I'm really trying to break into this. Can you tell me how, what are the places to play? That's a crucial one. Which ones are worth playing? Because people will tell you, they'll go, don't play there, it's rubbish, you don't get anything from it. That one's worth playing. I think that's probably my main advice, is network and build your knowledge. Things like, I think I've not really participated in them, but I think things like Comedy Collective on Facebook are supposed to be quite useful in finding out what's what.
Okay.
And I think there are a couple of podcasts as well with, aimed at newer acts, so they might be worth checking out.
Find those things. And then assuming that I can survive this year of gigging as much as I can, and I do make it to Edinburgh next year, what would be your advice for when I'm in Edinburgh? What do I need to really be thinking about?
Well, I've only been to Edinburgh a handful of times, so it's sort of hard to know. But I think it's probably really selling the show, trying to get, because you're competing with stupid numbers of other shows. So really selling the show. I had a postgrad student, go up to the Free Fringe this Edinburgh, and most audiences were like 6. Actually, she had an audience of 2 once, and it's a sort of an hour show. So, and she said it was brilliant actually. But leafleting. Definitely get your show in the brochure, the official brochures, because that can bring more people in. Leafleting like hell. Try and get press coverage. Try and get media coverage if you can. Network like hell. Talk to other acts. And then just give every show 100%, even if there are already 2 people in.
Brilliant. And then I know we've taken a lot of your time.
That's fine.
The last thing I'd like to talk to you about, this evening we're going to go off and watch a comedy competition that you're actually going to be a judge for tonight at the Canterbury Festival. What are you looking for when an act comes on stage? Is it just what's going to make you laugh, or are you thinking about what makes the audience laugh as a bigger thing? What are you really looking for when you see a comedian?
I think I think what you're looking for in a comedian is more than one thing. I think it's always impressive to see somebody who can just hit big with an audience, like boom, 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 boom. That's always good to watch. Because it's, even if it's something, well, it can be galling if you don't find it funny, but you can't not be impressed by that, because that isn't easy to do. So that is important. But I think, in terms of what I like, I think it's important to say, comedy is like any other art form. You have taste in comedy. You know, the people I like aren't going to be the people that the next person's going to like. And the things that I'm looking for personally are what I would call the "we're not in Kansas anymore" moments. So they're the moments where you just go, this is interesting, I've not seen this before. So go back to Stuart Lee, that moment where he's pretending to be surrounded by the ghosts of dead comedians, that was a "we're not in Kansas anymore" moment. I had a student who graduated 10 years ago, and he's one of the most naturally talented comics I've ever come across. And a very nice guy as well. What he didn't have is that willingness to sort of suck it up and go through the horrible trial of kind of becoming accepted on the circuit. But he would go out there every week with a semi-improvised, surreal kind of stand-up routine of up to 15 minutes in length, and kill the audience, like brilliant, enormous laughs. We had a TV producer filmmaker, you know, who'd done stand-up showcases on TV, and he just went, he's one of the most exciting new acts I've seen. And he, like one week he came out and he did a whole thing about how he'd fallen. I think it was he fell over and hit his head, and when he woke up he was a woman. And then he went and seduced a ginger-haired heavy rock fan who was a virgin as a woman. And that, I can't remember how it ended, but it was like everything he'd said, I was like, I don't know where this is going, but I want to see. Yeah. We're not in Kansas anymore. So I think, you know, if you see somebody where you go, that's startling. We had a Dutch student who would do things like, she's very shy, very quiet, and she did a show while she was here doing her masters, where she did the whole thing in Dutch. Right, the whole show is in Dutch. She had some cheats, you know, to help keep us on board. Like, she had a PowerPoint behind, which helped. Sometimes you could just get what she was saying through gesture, sometimes through the sound of the word being close enough. Yeah, it's, you know, those moments where you go, I don't know where we're going with this. I don't know where it's... How are you doing this? This is not... How are you doing that? That's not possible. I like that a lot. That's what I look for in comedy. There's other things as well. I mean, I love a really smart, sharp political gag. I like it when people use shock in comedy in a really smart way that actually has insight. involved. I think that's why something like Louis C.K. is so great. It's because, like, Jimmy Carr's amazing as a technician, but I think ultimately he would himself say that it's about the pointlessness. He doesn't mean anything. It's just he doesn't mean anything by these terrible things that he says so cleverly. Whereas I think with somebody like Louis C.K., he's actually offering insights about the shocking things that he says. If you see what I mean,
Yeah.
It's a slight difference there. You know, same with Lenny Bruce, same with Bill Hicks, same with Stuart Lee, actually, for that matter. I think when they say shocking things, there's a kind of a reason for it. I think sometimes with Doug Stanhope as well, although sometimes I find it, he's just saying that's shock. Personal taste, of course, but...
So it's going a bit back round to what we were saying about Brecht then. You like comedy that's got something to say, that's going to change the way that the audience see things?
I do like comedy with something to say, but I have quite a broad taste as well. I love Ross Noble, for example, and although I think there are occasionally moments where he's sort of saying something, and I think there's a broader thing to do with celebrating life that kind of underlies his work. A lot of it is the excitement of not knowing where it's going to go because he's playing all the time, and you can see that he's playing. And even though you know some of this is probably prepared, you know a lot of it isn't because he's directly playing on things that are happening right in front of you. He's amazing.
It's been a really, really fascinating insight. Ollie, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's nice talking to you.